All right, welcome to our final lesson of our Absolutism and Revolutions unit. This is topic 10.9, the Latin American Revolutions. We're continuing the theme here of a bunch of countries deciding we don't like the government we currently have and we're going to do something about it. The goal for you today is to be able to explain how the Enlightenment ideas and political crisis in Europe both led to the independence movements across Latin America. For reference, this is kind of the pattern we've been following with all these revolutions. This is good review for the unit test. So we start with structural inequality, that is, something about society that's making things unfair or unequal. And that leads to eventually the development of people coming up with new ideas to challenge authority, to challenge those who are in power because of that unfairness and inequality built into the system. Those new ideas challenging authority creates a crisis that weakens the governments. In this case, the new ideas we've been talking about over and over again are the ideals of the Enlightenment. That's our John Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Voltaire, those things we talked about in the Enlightenment lesson that keep coming up ever since in the American Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, and yet again in the Latin revolutions. So that structural inequality leads to people coming up with new ideas, that leads to a crisis that weakens the government, and groups start to challenge the system once they see it as weak. That challenge leads to a new government being established, either overthrowing of the new government or breaking away and creating a new government. But either way, a new government is formed, but these new governments still face problems, right? It doesn't solve everything. This is the framework that we're going to be using to understand the revolutions in Latin America because it's kind of the framework that most political revolutions follow. So let's take a look at the structural inequality in the Spanish colonies, right? Spain had colonized much of the North and South America and the New World because they were kind of the first to land there thanks to Columbus. They took over large areas, most of South America, pretty much all of Central America, large chunks of North America from the southwest United States and Mexico. Their society was very hierarchical. They had a very rigid social hierarchy with distinct roles for everyone in this hierarchy. At the top of this hierarchy were the Peninsulares. I'm probably saying that wrong. These are the people who were born in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula, and they were born in Spain. They then traveled to the New World, to the colonies, and they held most of the power in society in these colonies. Below the Peninsulares were the Creoles. And the Creoles were people also of European descent, right? They have the same blood as the people in the Peninsulares group. The difference is the Creoles were born in the Americas. They were still often very wealthy and owned a lot of land. They just had little to no political power. That was all held by the people above them, the Peninsulares. Now, below all of them were the Mestizo and Mulatto populations. These were people of mixed European and native descent or European and African descent. A lot of the colonists from Spain were men, and so when they got here, there weren't a lot of women. So they took brides, they took wives from the native populations and sometimes from the African populations they had enslaved. Now, of course, there's a huge power imbalance here, right? Because these white men have a lot of power and authority, and the native women and African women, they don't really have any. So whether some of these marriages were consensual, yeah, probably some of them might have been. And whether some of these relationships were not consensual and essentially were rape, that is also very possible in many cases. Regardless of how these children came to be, they were of mixed European and native or African blood, and because of this, they were seen as less than the Creoles, who were of pure European blood but born in the New World, and who were themselves below the Peninsulares, who were of pure European blood but were born in Europe and thus had all political power in these colonies. And then at the very bottom of all this were the indigenous peoples and the enslaved Africans kidnapped and brought over here to do all the work. So the indigenous populations were the people who built the empires that we looked at in our pre-Columbian cultures unit, right? These people are still around. They weren't all killed off. Yes, many died because of disease and warfare, but there was still a very large indigenous population who was being forced to do a lot of the work, and enslaved Africans as well. And these two groups were at the very bottom of society in the Spanish colonial era. So you can see a lot of structural inequality built into this rigid system. The real structural problem that kind of ignites this, yes, there's a lot of problems with slavery and racism, absolutely not trying to downplay that, but what creates this revolution is actually the Creoles controlled the land, they controlled wealth, and they controlled the local economies, but they were excluded from the highest government positions. So they had wealth, but they didn't have political power, and the Creoles were very upset with this. They wanted the same political power as the Peninsulares. So this created friction between the Creoles, who were of European descent but born in the New World, and the Peninsulares, who were Europeans born in the Old World but had moved to the New World. And these are the two groups who were basically going to be fighting in most of these revolutions that we're talking about. The oppressed native populations, the mestizos, mulattoes, enslaved Africans, they do play a role, but really this conflict is between the Creoles and the Peninsulares, at least in these first revolutions we're looking at. We looked at these structural vulnerabilities built in the Spanish system, and now there's new ideas that are starting to circulate, right? This is the time of the 1700s. The Enlightenment ideas are spreading across the Atlantic world with key beliefs that people have natural human rights that everyone shares, the right to life, liberty, equality, and property rights. And the government should be based on the consent of the governed. That is, any government can only have a true legitimate government only has authority over you because we allow it to have authority over us. I've always shown how these ideas were very popular but also very dangerous, as they sparked revolutions in North America with the American Revolution, in France with the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror that we looked at, and the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved populations said, yes, we also deserve equality. These Enlightenment ideals also apply to us. We too are human beings. And now the colonists in Latin America are going to be asking very similar questions about authority. So now to the crisis that weakens the Spanish authority. In 1808, this guy named Napoleon, who we briefly referenced at the end of our French Revolution lessons, had named himself French Emperor in 1804, and in 1808, he invades Spain. Now, how France went from being this, Enlightenment republic based on revolutionary ideals to an empire ruled by one guy, Napoleon, we're going to get there next unit. For now, he's just going to pop into this lesson as he is the spark that leads to these revolutions in the New World by his invasion of Spain in the Old World. So France right here is right next to Spain, right? They're right next to each other. And in 1808, Napoleon uses the Revolutionary Army to invade Spain and gets rid of the Spanish king, Habsburg. And instead, he places his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, onto the Spanish throne, making Napoleon's brother, Joseph, the new king of Spain, not because of some divine right, but because Napoleon's army came in with more guns and pushed the Spanish king out. You can maybe see how this is going to lead to a crisis of authority, right? Where does your legitimacy come from? In this case, they're not claiming God, they're claiming guns. So this is the major legitimacy crisis here, right? The colonists start to ask, well, if the Spanish king is gone and we agreed that he was in charge because of, the divine right of kings, then who has the right to rule over the colonies, right? That king's gone. The guy that we believe God put in charge has been just gotten rid of by Napoleon's army. So who's in charge now? Napoleon's brother? Nah. Many of the Creoles started to argue that political power should return to the people. And to be clear, what they mean by the people is they mean them, the Creoles, not the populations of mixed descent or the native populations or enslaved people. When the Creoles said political power should return to the people, they meant political power should go to the Creoles. And before you get up all in arms about how hypocritical this is, the American Revolution wasn't this way. They based their idea on their revolution on the ideals of the Enlightenment. Remember, many of the people who organized the American Revolution were themselves slave owners, and they were not arguing for the political equality of enslaved populations or native populations either. So revolutions start to pop off beginning around 1810, with independence movements spreading all across Latin America. For reference, Latin America is any place essentially in the New World, North and South and Central America, where they speak a language that is derived from Latin. So that is your Spanish, your Portuguese, even your French. These are all considered Latin America because the languages are of Latin origin. That is the origin of the Latin language of the Romans. And in 1800, you can see right here, like this giant yellow area, this is Brazil. It's owned by Portugal. The green areas are part of the Spanish Empire. You can see the French kind of only have, right, French Guinea over here. They are Santo Domingo or Santo Domingue. Right, that's kind of in dispute at this point because they've had their revolution, but they're also dealing with Napoleon's armies at this time. Napoleon's popping in and out of this whole story. We'll get to Napoleon's story next unit in full. So essentially, all these areas are considered Latin America because, again, their languages are of Latin origin. Well, they decided to, within about 30 years, we go from these are all colonies to these are all areas that have declared independence and created their own governments. And it's the Creole leaders who organize the rebellions against the Spanish authority. Their goal here is to create independent nations instead of remaining colonies of Spain. Because after all, well, if the Spanish king, who was appointed by God, is no longer in charge, well then, we should be independent, and us Creoles should have the power in our society. So, in the South American revolutions, there are really two important Creole revolutionary leaders that emerged that you need to be aware of. Simón Bolívar is the first one, who helped liberate the countries, the modern nations of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. And he believed that South America should become an independent place from Spain. His dream was actually to create an area called Gran Colombia, which would be this large area. It's got Panama in there, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. He wanted them all to be one single country with its own government. In fact, he had dreams of creating basically a massive government that controlled pretty much most of Latin America united, or at least South America united under a single government, separate from Spain. That didn't happen. In fact, it fractured into many different governments, and that's why we see South America the way it is today. But that was his dream. The other revolutionary leader in South America was José de San Martín, who helped lead independence movements in Argentina, Chile, and Peru, so these red areas here on the map. And together, their military campaigns helped to defeat the Spanish forces across South America and established all these new independent countries. Now, it's important to note, again, they were both Creoles, so they were fighting for the rights of fellow Creoles. They weren't necessarily fighting to get rid of the rigid hierarchy that had existed. They just wanted the Creoles to be on top of that hierarchy. So the problems with the indigenous populations or people of mixed descent, those are still going to continue to exist even after these revolutions get their independence and win against Spain. The Mexican Revolution follows quite a different path, right? Whereas the South American revolutions are led by the elite Creoles in the social hierarchy, Mexico's revolution was largely led by local lower social groups, including the indigenous peoples and the mestizos populations, the people of mixed descent. So the South American revolutions led by the higher up people in the hierarchy, whereas the Mexican Revolution was led mostly by people lower on the hierarchy. And again, I'd like to point out, at the time of Mexican independence, this giant orange area was Mexico, right? And today, we know this is part of the United States, but that becomes part of the United States after the U.S. and Mexico go to war with each other, and the U.S. basically takes a third to a half of Mexican land. But that's a lesson for your U.S. history class. We're not really going to get into that in this world history class. So in 1810, a Creole priest named Miguel Hidalgo, so he's from the upper classes of society, he calls for rebellion against Spanish rule. But again, he is a priest, so he is a religious leader, but also from the upper Creole class. Not the Peninsulares, who are the top part, but still this upper group. And he calls for Mexico to be independent from Spain, just like you saw in the revolutionary movements in South America. Now, Hidalgo's movement does not win. He was defeated and he was executed for this, but the movement for Mexican independence really does continue on from here, so he's seen kind of as the starting point of the Mexican efforts for independence. But here you can see in 1821, Mexico finally did win their independence, and you can see Mexico in this is a lot bigger than it is today. In particular, right, Texas is now part of the United States. The borders are a little different. Nuevo Mexico is now actually several different states in the United States, and Californias is actually, again, several other states in the United States as well. This is all, again, from the Mexican-American War, which will be covered in your U.S. history class. But that's not the end of the Mexican Revolution, right? So a little bit later, a couple decades later, an Austrian archduke named Maximilian von Habsburg tried to claim control over Mexico in 1864. That's right, he is a member of the Austrian Habsburg family, the incest jaws. So he claims himself Emperor of Mexico in 1864. He gets some support, but ultimately his efforts fail horribly, and he winds up being executed by a firing squad 3 years later in 1867. So here's the Archduke Maximilian von Habsburg looking all fancy as Emperor of Mexico, and this is how it started. And this is how it ended, with him in a coffin as he was executed by firing squad. Just like the land revolutions of Simón Bolívar and San José Martín went one way, the Mexican Revolution was slightly different. The Brazilian Revolution path to independence was also different from those other two movements. It really wasn't a revolution. In 1822, the Portuguese prince Dom Pedro declared that Brazil would now be independent of Portugal. This also has a lot to do with Napoleon's wars over in Europe. We'll get there next unit. But unlike many other revolutions, Brazil's independence happened pretty much without any large-scale war, and Brazil established itself as a constitutional monarchy with barely, any guns fired compared to especially the other revolutions across Latin America. So that's how Brazil got independence. So the consequences of independence. By the 1820s, most of Latin America had gained their freedom from European rule. However, independence did not solve their problems. I mean, it solved some of their problems, like being ruled over by countries across the ocean, but most of their other serious problems, structural inequality, still existed. Many of these new nation states faced a lot of problems, right? Political instability. They had problems figuring out how to govern themselves, how to establish these new governments separate from the way they had been living. There was still a lot of economic inequality with a lot of people who were very, very wealthy and a lot more people who were very, very, very poor. And there was still that hierarchy, rigid hierarchy that was causing inequality. So there were struggles over who should have power that was spilling over. And these revolutions changed who governed those regions, but it didn't change many of the social inequalities that led to the revolutions. So here's the big idea of Unit 10 as a whole. The Enlightenment created ideas that challenged traditional authority. That is, the idea that power comes from God and government's appointed by God or gods or whatnot. And when governments faced economic or political crises, these ideas from the Enlightenment inspired people to challenge their existing political system. And as a result, revolutions spread far across the Atlantic world on both sides of the Atlantic. We see these revolutions in France, America, Haiti, all across the Latin world, and these are all, again, in large part to the ideas of the Enlightenment. So let's review that revolutionary pattern one more time, right? Most revolutions will follow this very similar process. They'll start with the old system has some structural inequality built into it. That will lead to people coming up with new ideas challenging the authority system. That then leads to crisis weakening the government, and then revolution begins. But then that revolution creates new governments that will face their own challenges. For our assessment, you really do need to understand this pattern that we kept discussing throughout this unit. These revolutions reshaped the Atlantic world, countries on both sides of the ocean, but they were also connected to a much larger conflict back in Europe. In the early 1800s, it really was one leader who would attempt to reshape Europe through war and conquest of his neighbors. Really, you already know who this is if you stop and think. He's been popping in and out of this story all semester. It's the one, the only, Napoleon Bonaparte, who we will be talking about at length next unit. But how he goes from a soldier in the king's army to a revolutionary leader to turning the Revolutionary Republic into an empire that tries to conquer and pretty much does conquer all of Europe and impacting the Haitian revolutions, the Latin revolutions, and the independence of Brazil. That's the story we're going to tell later. But for now, we're done with this unit. We've talked about the rise of absolutism, the backlash to that was the Enlightenment, and then the revolutions that come from that. So what I need you to do, as always, finish by rewriting today's goal, typing out 3 complete thoughts, not copying and pasting, not just simple words, but 3 complete thoughts that you learned from these notes, and then write out that one question that I will respond to help integrate this information into your brain. Until next class, when we're going to review, I'll see you then.